They told us that God was a he, that the divine was distant, masculine, and singular. But this story is incomplete because in the earliest layers of the Hebrew tradition, long before any edits, councils, and reforms, there was a goddess beside him, and her name was Asherah. She was called the Queen of Heaven, the Mother of all living, and the sacred tree in the midst of the temple. For centuries she was worshipped alongside Yahweh, not as his rival, but as his consort and divine counterpart. And then she disappeared. She was ripped from scripture and stripped from the altar, buried under centuries of translation and silence, not because she was unimportant, but because she represented everything the rising priesthood feared, such as feminine power, embodied wisdom, and the sacred right to co-create. But the divine can't be erased, only forgotten, and now memory is returning, because once you see her, you begin to see the entire story differently. Long before the Bible became what we know today, spiritual life in the ancient Near East was filled with gods and with goddesses, sky beings and earth mothers, divine couples ruling in balance. In the land of Canaan, before the Israelites fully emerged as a distinct culture, there was one name that echoed across temples and shrines: Ashura. She was no minor figure. She was the great lady of heaven, the mother of gods and the bringer of fertility, the one who nourished both land and womb. And what makes this even more than merely myth is the stone and the scroll. In the 9th and 8th century BCE, a set of inscriptions was discovered in a place called Kuntilet Ajrud, deep in the Sinai desert. On these fragments of pottery were blessings written in Hebrew, not in Canaanite, not in Egyptian, but early Israelite Hebrew, and they read, "I bless you by Yahweh and his Ashurah." Now let that sink in. This was not against Yahweh, not beneath Yahweh, but with him, a sacred partnership and a divine pair. Even in the Hebrew Bible, there are traces of this. The book of Kings tells us of how King Joshua led a series of brutal religious reforms, destroying the altars to Asherah, cutting down her sacred poles, and burning her statues. So why would such a reform be necessary if she wasn't once revered? Well, obviously, because she was there, she was in the temple, she was beside the throne, she was etched into the lives and into the prayers of the people. And yet, over generations, her name was removed, her symbols were outlawed, and her voice was silenced. This happened not because she didn't belong, but because she once did, and because her memory threatened a narrative that had to be controlled. The question isn't whether Ashura was worshipped, but the real question is why they needed her forgotten. Her name is woven through the oldest layers of scripture, only to vanish completely as monotheism took shape. And that vanishing was no accident. As Israelite religion evolved from a polytheistic or henotheistic structure into exclusive monotheism, power began to consolidate, and with power came control, especially over who could define the divine and who had access to it. Enter the Deuteronomistic reforms, a sweeping religious purge during the reign of King Joshua around 620 BCE. During this time, the priesthood rewrote the rules, centralized worship in Jerusalem, and systematically erased competing symbols, especially those of the sacred feminine. Asherah wasn't just a goddess. She was a living challenge to the emerging patriarchal order because she represented fertility, wisdom, and embodied divinity. She didn't need a priest to intercede. She didn't require sacrifice to be pleased. She was the altar found in trees, in groves, in wombs, in life itself. And that terrified the gatekeepers of theology, because if the divine feminine was honored alongside the masculine, then hierarchy dissolved. Power became circular and no longer vertical. Wisdom became intuitive and not institutional, and they simply couldn't allow that. So they demonized what they couldn't fully delete. The Asherah poles, symbols of sacred trees and life force, were called fake idols. The priestesses were rebranded as prostitutes, and the goddess who once stood beside Yahweh was reduced to a ghost in the margins of scripture. This wasn't just a theological shift, but it was a political conquest of the sacred. This was a war on the body, a severing of spirit from soil, and a silencing of the divine voice in women and in the earth itself. But what is buried is not dead, and what was erased can still be remembered. You can erase a name from a book. You can burn down a temple, silence a priestess, and cut down a sacred tree. But one thing that you can't do is fully erase the divine feminine, because she always finds a way to remain, hidden in plain sight, encoded in symbol, and whispered in dreams. Even in the Bible, fragments of Asherah still flicker between the lines. In Jeremiah 7 and 44, we hear of the Queen of Heaven, a title never given to Mary, but used by women who baked cakes and burned incense to feminine deities. The prophet condemns these women, but the devotion is undeniable. And then there is Sophia, which is wisdom. In the Hebrew texts, later absorbed by Christian mystics, wisdom is personified as female, which is radiant, eternal, and present at the moment of creation. She is not a servant of God, but she is a co-creator. She co-creates with him. In the Gnostic Gospels, texts banned by the early church, this wisdom becomes a full being. She becomes Sophia, who falls, who births creation, and who seeks reunification with the divine. She is the Asherah in exile. She is the feminine godhead, simply renamed and reframed, surviving in mystic memory. Even the Virgin Mary, sanitized by centuries of doctrine, still holds the pose of the goddess. She is crowned with a serpent at her feet, wearing blue, which is the ancient color of the sky goddesses. She is revered not for power over others, but for her own power to hold, to birth, and to radiate grace. Asherah also lives in symbol. She lives in the sacred tree, which is a constant thread from Eden to Kabbalah's tree of life. She lives in the symbol of the serpent, which was once sacred but now demonized. She lives in Shekinah in Kabbalistic mysticism, which is the feminine presence of God, still revered in Jewish mysticism. She lives in the symbol of the dove, the grove, the pillar, all ancient echoes of her form. Her erasure was never complete, because even the deepest silence carries the shape of what was once spoken. And now, today, that memory is finally rising again, not as nostalgia, but as necessity. This isn't just about forgotten history, but it is about healing. When Asherah was erased, it wasn't just a goddess who disappeared, but it was an entire way of knowing, a whole mode of being that was stripped from the human soul. The feminine wasn't just removed from the divine, but it was removed from authority, from intuition, from the body, and ultimately from the earth. And without her, without the feminine, the sacred became distant. It became cold and abstract. It became something to fear, to worship and obey, but not something to embody. That is why the divine feels incomplete for so many people. That is why prayer might feel hollow. That is why our rituals often feel disconnected, because we are still operating in a system that is designed to exclude the feminine from the holy. But now she is returning, not just in words or theories, but in energy, in dreams, in the voice you've been hearing whisper through your own body all along. Ashura's return is not about rebranding a forgotten goddess in history, but it is about reclaiming what was always yours, your right to trust your own intuition, your own right to honor your body as a sacred temple, and your right to speak to the divine without asking for permission. Because restoring the feminine isn't just about balance, but it is about survival. It's about remembering that creation is not a hierarchy, but it is a dance. And when the masculine and when the feminine are allowed to walk together again within us, around us, as above, so below, that is the moment when wholeness returns. That is when the temple is rebuilt. Not a temple in stone, but a temple in spirit. She was never truly gone, only hidden and waiting. And now that you remember her, the question is what you'll do with that remembrance. Will you keep Ashura buried, safe behind intellectual curiosity, or will you actually let her rise again? Will you let her rise through your voice, through your rituals, and through your embodiment? If this message stirred something in you, then please like this video so it reaches others who are also ready to remember. Please comment below. Have you felt the absence of the sacred feminine in your past? And have you encountered her even if you didn't know her name? Please also share this with somebody who grew up feeling disconnected from a God that never quite looked like them. And for those of you who want to walk even further, ritual guides, deeper teachings, and sacred tools are on my Patreon. The link is below in the description. Remember that Asherah lives in every branch, in every breath, and in every moment of sacred remembering. And now she lives inside of you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.